All right, folks. So now today we're going to talk a little bit about amnesia that occurs due to damage outside of the medial temporal lobes. And we're going to talk a little bit about the limbic system as well. So although the medial temporal lobe, the hippocampus in particular, is the principal site of declarative learning and memory, we do know that anterograde amnesia can also occur due to damage to other brain regions, especially those that are connected to the medial temporal lobe. So what you're looking at here is a kind of map of the limbic system. Typically, we tend to treat the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe in general as being more simple and more insular than it actually is. We have a lot of different connections with other cortical regions, such as the temporal lobes, the frontal lobes, and the parietal lobes. And that's because the hippocampus and other areas in the medial temporal lobe are utilizing multimodal information. And so kind of the point that you can kind of see here is that these connections are feeding into other brain areas, and other brain areas are making contact with the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is really important for processing information in such a way that it's consolidated into long-term memory and distributed throughout the brain. So the hippocampus, if you damage that, destroys that ability to form new explicit memories. But kind of one of the other major points of this graph is because a lot of these other areas are also providing input to the hippocampus, if those connections to and from the hippocampus are damaged, the hippocampus can't do its job, and that will also produce a variety of different memory problems. So we're going to talk about a few of those right now. So we know that damage to the thalamus can actually produce memory impairments due to its connections with the hippocampus and to the medial temporal lobe. So for example, here we have a glioma. So this is a tumor that grows out of glial cells in the thalamus that can potentially cause damage. Here is an instance of a thalamic stroke. And then we'll talk about some other things that can result due to medial temporal lobe damage. And one of those things is Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. So we've already kind of talked about Karl Wernicke. He's a German doctor from the late 1800s. It's the same Wernicke that described Wernicke's aphasia, where you can produce speech, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So production's okay, but comprehension is not. And we saw that that happens due to damage to the superior temporal gyrus. So Wernicke is involved in learning about a particular type of syndrome that also produces amnesic deficits. And then we also have Sergei Korsakoff. He was a Russian doctor also in the late 1800s. Each of them described a neurological disorder that often tends to occur together in Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of those particular issues. So Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome is associated with a few different symptoms. So first of all, we get what Wernicke noted as encephalopathy. And encephalopathy involves a few different things. First of all, it involves what is called nystagmus. These are involuntary, very rapid eye movements that are uncontrollable. It also involved ataxia. These are uncoordinated movements. This includes things like intention tremor or instability in posture or postural muscles, and a drunken sailor gait, which we learned in the last unit can be due to cerebellar damage. So that's the first part. Korsakoff reported a psychosis that included anterograde amnesia, as well as some retrograde amnesia, as well as confabulation. So confabulation will often occur. I've seen it also happen in dementia patients as well. Confabulation occurs when you believe something happened and it didn't actually happen. But here's what's really critical. You're not actually attempting to be deceitful. You actually do believe that this thing happened, even when it didn't. So confabulations can be provoked or they can be spontaneous. This can include provoked confabulation can include false responses to questions about a person's memory. Anybody can. Spontaneous confabulation typically occurs without prompting. It can include inaccuracies, and it may also be based on events that did not happen. Confabulation is a specific disorder that's not always associated with amnesia. It is believed that part of the reason that confabulation happens is because of loss of source memory. So something in your past happened that was like this, but you don't remember the circumstances under which it happened. So you retrieve it and think it actually happened when it didn't. We don't entirely understand confabulation, but we do know that some regions are particularly involved, including the thalamus, the mammillary bodies, and the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe in particular is important for distinguishing the time sequence of events, and we know that time-based confusion is often very common in confabulation. Now, the reason that this Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome happens is because of a vitamin B deficiency, in particular a thiamine deficiency. We typically get it from our diets. It is needed for glucose metabolism and neurotransmitter synthesis. If you are vegetarian or vegan, please take a vitamin B supplement. Typically, we will find that glucose metabolism and neurotransmitter synthesis tends to occur near the ventricles. There's a high rate of glucose metabolism. So if there is a thiamine deficiency, areas near the ventricles will be particularly affected, and the cells will swell and basically die. Now, thiamine deficiency often tends to happen because of malnutrition that is caused by alcohol abuse. Without proper nutrition, it can occur with other types of malnutrition, but alcohol abuse is the most common type. So you might be kind of surprised by this because oftentimes we find that when people have small to moderate doses of alcohol, it's actually an appetite stimulant. Sometimes when you drink, you want all of the greasy food that you know you shouldn't have, but heavy alcohol use, like to the point where one is an alcoholic, actually suppresses appetite. This can occasionally also occur if people are very deeply involved in eating disorders like anorexia, but we're most often going to see this in the homeless. Generally, alcohol intoxication produces reversible temporary effects on the cerebellum and on the hippocampus by increasing GABA. So this is part of the reason why if you drink a sufficient amount of alcohol, you may find that your speech slurs because your cerebellum is getting inhibited. You may actually have a blackout period where you don't remember what happened the night before because the hippocampus has been shut down temporarily by all of that GABA activity. Generally, this intoxication will reduce anterograde memory because it's dependent on glutamate. It also affects motor activity and balance. It is not temporary use like this that produces Korsakoffs. It's in chronic use in combination with malnutrition. You can treat this with a thiamine infusion, but it will not repair damaged cells. It can cause permanent atrophy of the mammillary bodies, the thalamus, and the cerebellum as well. So next we're going to take a look at what nystagmus looks like. Why aren't you working? There. So you can kind of see this is a case of an involuntary eye movement. That is a case of nystagmus. So the mammillary bodies, which are located right here and do have connections to the hippocampus, can also lead to amnesia if they're damaged. So here's where they are. Here's kind of where they are. If you're looking at different views of the brain, you can actually see they're located very closely next to some of those ventricles that we talked about, and that makes them potentially an area for potential damage. So here's just another view of them right here. Again, located very, very close to the ventricles and making them vulnerable. Now, if you had to look at the difference between the brain of somebody who is struggling with an alcohol addiction versus one that is not, which one is the correct answer? The correct answer is this one. So as you can kind of see, we do have some atrophy. In particular, you'll notice that the ventricles are quite enlarged. The cerebellum has shrunken. The frontal lobes are very, very atrophied. And the thalamus is also smaller in size. So now I want to briefly talk about a temporary form of amnesia. Amnesia is typically permanent due to the reasons that we just discussed, but there are some cases of temporary amnesia. So one of these is what is referred to as transient global amnesia. This is an acute onset of anterograde amnesia with some mild retrograde loss. It typically lasts from about 2 to 12 hours, and it can be caused by a variety of different things, either a significant amount of physical or emotional stress. It can occur because of a transient ischemic attack, so blood flow to different parts of the brain are temporarily blocked, and that can cause this to happen. This can occur because of a seizure or things like migraine. People may forget how they got where they are and what they're doing, though memory for more distant events tends to be intact. It tends to strike pretty suddenly. It's not associated with other neurological signs that we would see in a stroke, such as paralysis, numbness, seizures, or so on. Typically, this very rarely recurs, and there tend to be no major residual deficits. Now, focal retrograde amnesia is very, very rare. Given the wide cortical distribution of retrograde memory, you would have to damage the entire cortex to basically lose all retrograde memories. So this is incredibly rare. And typically, focal retrograde amnesia does not typically occur in most people. Long-term memories are widely distributed throughout the cortex due to consolidation. So what we will find is that most people that present with this do not have a history of major neuropsychiatric illness, though this will potentially occur during a stressful period. People may lose their memory for their identities, virtually all autobiographical memories. Only episodic memory seems to be affected, and it usually will lead to recovery within several days. There are a few different reasons that this type of amnesia can occur. It can occur because of multifocal damage, lesions due to little strokes, drugs, or epilepsy, and that will lead to visible damage that you can actually see on a scan. If there is no visible brain damage, it's what we consider psychogenic. There are no visible lesions, and they're very, very rare. This can occur potentially because of head trauma. And it can produce what is called a fugue state. Often people in this state will travel away from their homes. They won't realize how they got there. You see this kind of stuff in movies and TV, but really it's incredibly rare. Now, repressed memory tends to be pretty controversial. It tends to be very specific for traumatic events such as assault, abuse, violent attacks. Typically, this will occur because of a mental block. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the coming weeks. We tend to find that emotion heightens memory. So generally, it is unlikely given that emotion heightens memory, it's unlikely that these memories don't exist. More likely, they are being willfully denied or being blocked in this particular case. So now we're going to move on to talk about an area that the hippocampus is part of. We're going to start talking about the limbic system, so the hippocampus, the amygdala, and other areas, and the role it plays in emotional processing. So the first person to really talk about the limbic system was Paul Broca, who we have already talked about. He demonstrated a patient that had production deficits, so Broca's aphasia. They can't produce speech, but they can understand it. So Broca was the first to describe subcortical regions basically forming a ring or a limbus around the brainstem. Go back. He did not actually describe the function. And so his basic function of the limbic lobe was basically made up of the cingulate cortex or the cingulate gyrus and then the hippocampus. These are a part of the limbic system, but these are two of many that are associated with the limbic system as we tend to think of it today. So the next person to really talk about the development of the limbic system was James Papez. He was a neurologist, and he proposed a mechanism of emotion that he referred to as the circle of Papez. And it was basically designed to be a modification and an enhancement of Broca's limbic lobe. A lot of the research that he did came from observing patients with different types of diseases and different types of brain lesions. He primarily looked at rabies patients. He also studied it in animals by injecting rabies virus into the hippocampus and watching its progression. So he utilized a combination of clinical observation and examining brains post-mortem. In addition to rabies, he also looked at tumors in the cingulate cortex. What we tend to find with people who have damage to the cingulate cortex, they tend to have apathy and decreased motivation. So generally what we will tend to find with rabies, if you are bitten by a rabid animal like a bat, about 2 to 4 days after the bite, if it's left untreated, you will develop a fever, usually about 101 to 102 degrees, a headache, you'll feel pretty irritable, fluish, low energy. And generally, what you will find is later, you will feel restless, hyperactivity, feeling terror, possibly acting maniacal, screaming, throat spasm, seizure, and death. And this is what Papez observed. In addition to this, you do actually observe small little lesions in the temporal lobes and the hippocampus. So a little bit more about rabies. It is a mammalian virus. It does attack motor neurons as well. Probably one of the most common signs of rabies is foaming at the mouth. The reason that this happens is that you have paralysis of the throat and you are not able to actually swallow saliva due to that paralysis. So based on his observations and examining brains post-mortem, Papez concluded that these regions were associated with emotion given the behavior of his patients. So here is one of those patients that he observed. This particular patient had to be restrained. So this is the original circuit that was developed by Papez, and it's since been modified to include other regions, but his original circuit was based on areas where Papez actually observed lesions caused by rabies. So we have the hippocampus, the fornix basically connects that to the mammillary bodies, the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and the cingulate gyrus. So Papez thought that this was basically a closed circuit. We now know, of course, that this is not a closed circuit. This circuit is constantly in communication with other areas of the brain. Now, one thing to note about Papez, and this is where we're going to close this lecture. One of the key mistakes that Papez made was a sampling error. In Importantly, he focused on looking at the hippocampus and looking for regions that had focal damage for diagnosing whether or not a patient had rabies. And rabies affects so much more than the hippocampus. And it actually turns out that focal hippocampal lesions do not produce dramatic emotional change. As we're going to discover, the amygdala plays a very large role in all of this. And as we will soon see, it will soon be added to our understanding of the limbic system. And we'll talk about how next time.